begin with you. You just arrived a few days ago from Kiev. What's it like? Give us a sense of what is going on. How are people getting along? What are you seeing, hearing, etc.?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'll try to explain what it's like living under these conditions. Literally 35 minutes ago, my phone went blaring, and that was the air raid alert. That meant that there is a missile or a drone that was going in direction of Kyiv. And what does that mean? It can mean nothing. So, because they're just seeing the missile going in one direction, it can end up in any other city, or it can end up in Kyiv. And you can never be 100% sure about that. And those air raid alerts can happen every day. We have had days when we were having air raid alerts like 5 times a day. And that basically means you have to go into hiding. But the reality also is that life goes on, so you cannot really be hiding like half of your life in shelter, right? You cannot be doing that. So typically people are just trying to follow what we all know now as a 2 walls rule. So in case there is air raid alert, you just need to hide like deep inside your house, like in your bathroom or wardrobe or anything. And so that you're at least not near the windows. That is the very basic rule. And the reality is that this is the rule that my 10-year-old son Martin knows about. But that is what he does. And sometimes I have to wake up him like in the middle of the night and say, like, hey, you have to go at least hide in the wardrobe, because that is what, things can happen. And sometimes it gets much more dangerous. Like on October 10th, that was the biggest attacks in Kyiv. That is when we woke up, and I was about to take him to school when I read on the news that there are explosions in Kyiv. And at first I thought, like, okay, we can still hide in the bathroom. Then I actually heard some explosions myself. And I realized I should probably go to the bomb shelter, which in our case is the closest metro station. And then I've seen my son, I was running around trying to gather stuff like something to sit on and some water and something to eat, because you don't know how long that will last. I was running around and I've seen my son, and he looks at me and he says, "Mom, am I going to die?" And that is something like this question, because my son has spent the first half a year of the war in the Western Ukraine, so he was not dealing with that too much, but he's back to Kyiv now. He goes to school, he goes to bomb shelters every time there are air raid alerts. But this was the first time he actually heard the explosions themselves, and he actually had to, "Mom, am I going to die?" And I had to calm him down while my heart was bumping, all the time. And I said to him, you remember, Mom and Dad told you we'll keep you safe, we're doing everything fine, just go to the bomb shelter. The scariest 2 minutes walk in my life from there, when hearing explosions and everything, going to the bomb shelter. And then on the way to the bomb shelter, he calmed down, and then he said, "Mom, are those the regular bombs or the nuclear bombs?" And I got really scared because I thought that he's panicking. And I said, "No, sweetie, it's okay, it's regular bombs, don't worry." And he looks at me half disappointed, and I don't understand what is happening at that point. And he says, "Because if it's nuclear bombs, I know what to do, because we learned that at school." And he was a 10-year-old who was proud to tell me that he learned something at school, and he can share that. But that is the very sad reality of the everyday life in Ukraine. And now when there is air raid alert, I got a picture of my son hiding in the bathroom from his father, because that is what he needs to do. But that is me in Kyiv, and Kyiv is relatively safe, apart from those, attacks on energy infrastructure. We shall probably talk about that a bit later. But the situation is so much worse for people living under occupation, or those close to the front line, because particularly people under occupation, it's. I think you have all seen the images and the data and all this information. I'm sitting in the special commission created by the Parliament on investigation of sexual crimes happened, during the military conflict. My experience has nothing to do with the experience of those women and children who suffered sexual violence by Russian soldiers. or even those who didn't. I've read a story on Instagram of one young woman. She's 20 or 21. She was a student in Kharkiv, my native city. And she thought that being in Kharkiv was not safe, so she decided to move to her parents' place in Izum, which you might have read about in the news because it fell under Russian occupation. So she was basically, she was there for 5 months under occupation. They don't have any internet service, so they don't know what is happening outside of the town. And her parents were hiding her in the sofa, inside the sofa, under the cushions, every time the Russian soldiers were passing by, just to save her from rape. And that is the reality that we're living in. So it's very scary. I'm trying to joke about this sometimes because that is the survival mechanism. But I guess one last thing I will say is that it's extremely scary, and it's everyday life for all of us. And every day I have to worry if I will be alive by the end of the day. But the most difficult part, of course, is every single morning I wake up and I text to my partner who's in the army, and I ask him if he is alive. And that is the scariest part of all of this. And I don't know when my life will get back to normal, when we would be able to be back together, when my son would not be able to, not being afraid of the bombs and all of that. So that is not a very, inspiring but realistic situation in Ukraine.
That's what we wanted to hear about. Yuriy, listening to that and given your work, what is your assessment of the war on Ukrainian society and its economy and so forth?
Economists are often portrayed as cold-blooded and, just caring about numbers. And so I'll start with some numbers, but it's really as scary and painful as Ina said. Sometime in the summer when you take a snapshot of how much Ukraine was occupied, you look at roughly 20% of the country. This is roughly 40% of Italy, more than a third of Germany. So think about this as an economic shock, not just humanitarian shock, but an economic shock. And so right there you have a huge economic loss, right? So GDP is going to contract by 30 to 50%. The unemployment rate is more than 35%. Inflation is projected to reach 30% by the end of the year. It's a huge shock. Millions of people fled the country, left their homes. And so it's very hard to run economy in these conditions. When you think about COVID and all the challenges we had at the time, this is nothing relative to what Ukraine has to deal with now. You think about the Great Depression and how bad the life was, when GDP contracted by 20%. It was a very terrible time in the US many years ago. But think about this as, times 2 and much more concentrated in time. And then you look at all sorts of other challenges that people have, like the destroyed energy infrastructure. When, it's really hard to run a business. Many of us here in California had an experience of living in a blackout for a few days. It was, you kind of go to Stone Age very quickly. You kind of try to survive on your gas stove, something basic. But now think about this in a different way. It's not just, 3 days in the summer. It's much darker, much colder. It's much less predictable. So it's much more difficult to run a business with these conditions. And obviously, the economy is under enormous pressure. But, having said this, I think it's amazing that Ukraine is still, out there as an economy. The government is functioning, taxes are collected, people have jobs, people have some, social safety net. So, the infrastructure, the economic infrastructure is still there. And, economy is gradually recovering. It's adapting to this new reality. But we should all appreciate that the size of the shock is just astronomical.
You mentioned, Yuriy, a minute ago, the effect on the power infrastructure. Maybe you could help us understand what the impact has been, and then how are Ukrainians preparing for the winter?
Yeah, that has been really tough because those attacks on energy infrastructure, which started on October 10th, that was Monday, and then basically every Monday up until yesterday. Yesterday, everybody were waiting for yet another set of attacks. They didn't happen for some reason, I don't know. But basically every Monday after that, they have been bombing energy infrastructure. So at first they were bombing electricity and heating stations. Then they, last week, they were bombing the hydroelectrical power stations, which led actually to big power shortages, particularly around Kyiv. I didn't have electricity for like 12 hours at my home, which means I didn't have electricity. That also meant I didn't have any water because the pump, which is electrical, couldn't function. I live on the 14th floor, so going up and down. No elevator, which is the slightest of the challenges. The biggest challenge was, of course, that when there is no electricity, apparently, which we were not aware a month ago, there is also no internet. So, I mean, of course, there is no internet because Wi-Fi is not connected, but there is no internet on your phone either. So you basically, like, imagine me working I typically work from my home because we are not advised to stay in the parliament for obvious reasons. And my team also works from home, so we coordinate online. And then suddenly, like, I don't have electricity, I don't know, they don't have electricity, or they do, but I wouldn't have a way to know that because we cannot connect to each other. And the situation is very dire. The Russians have damaged, not destroyed, but damaged, that's important differentiation, damaged about 40% of energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Some of it can be restored relatively quickly, and actually people working in the energy sector are doing miracles. Like, seriously, in some cases they would restore stations like in a matter of days. But then of course the new attacks come, so you just have to keep on doing that all the time. And we're very quickly running out of equipment to change the one that has been damaged or destroyed. So that is one of the big things that we are, addressing the global community now is help us get those transformers. Right. Transformers is the right word, right? Yeah, and all of that in order to fix our energy infrastructure, because right now life in Kyiv is very complicated because of those power shortages. I mean, we still get electricity, but it can get switched off for like 4 hours. So like you wake up and you don't have electricity. Theoretically, there is a schedule. So like you can look it online. Just also.
You can go online.
Yeah. So you have to get online in order to do that. But you can look at online and theoretically you can adjust. But then when some new attack happens, they say like the schedule doesn't work anymore. We'll be switching off houses and businesses at any time possible because just we have to to keep the energy running to avoid the full blackout, which would be the terrible situation. And because of that, indeed, as Yuriy said, it means that businesses cannot function because very simple fact. I go to a hairdresser and she says, well, you are lucky because we have light now, we have electricity and all. But yesterday I had 4 clients who came and I couldn't work with them and they had to leave. And you never know when that will happen. And that is this unpredictability is the most difficult part to deal with. So this energy shortages, particularly internet, and the unpredictability factor as the most complicated one. I mean, people can adjust living without electricity for 4 hours, as long as you know which 4 hours that will be, right? But if you don't, then you cannot adjust to that. And how people have been preparing, well, of course, that really depends on your living situation. Because, like, I live in a residential building. There is not really much I can do for my individual flat, right? So I just bought some, which I'm actually bringing from the States, some power banks for my phone and my computer, and then some, some minor heating devices that I can adjust for my home. But it's not really a lot you can do if you're living in a residential building and you rely on central heating. But the mayor of Kyiv has suggested that in case we don't have any electricity for a couple of days, people will have to evacuate. And that's 3 million people living in the city right now. And
are there evacuation plans to cover that?
The reality is that there is very little the government can do. And I think everybody is realistic about that. So what the mayor suggested is that just people have to think now of a plan B. like my plan B is my parents live near Kiev, like 50 kilometers. How much is that? Like 40 miles away from Kiev, and they have a private house. And I bought a generator for them in June because they didn't have electricity in June because they were really close to the occupied territories, and their house has been damaged by the Russian shelling, and they didn't have electricity for a couple of weeks actually. So I bought the generator for them in June, so I was well prepared. But people are trying to buy those for individual houses right now a lot, and that is again one of the things that we are asking the world to help with. Because people can move in with their friends and everything, and I think that is what people are thinking about now in terms of preparation for the winter.
Yuriy, when a country has experienced this kind of damage, it's almost a war of attrition in a way. What will it take ultimately to be able to recover?
It's a great question. Initially Putin had this plan that it's going to be like a blitzkrieg when in 3 days you're going to capture Kiev, install the new government. It has been more than 8 months. This war goes on and on and on. We're in a war of attrition. But in the war of attrition, it's not only the bravery of troops that matters. It's also who has a stronger economy, who can produce more tanks, more planes, more rifles, more guns, who can muster more resources. And if Ukraine were alone in this war, it would be very difficult. It would be very difficult. But Ukraine is not climbing this mountain alone. We have a lot of support from the international community, and this is really the lifeline for the economy and for the war effort. People say Ukraine can't win this war, but you have to put this in the right perspective. On the one hand, you have Russia, which is a much bigger country than Ukraine. But in a big scheme of things, it's only 2% of global GDP. Now, when you look at the size of the US economy or European Union, it's 10 times bigger each. So US economy is 10 times bigger than the Russian economy. The European Union is 10 times bigger in terms of the economy. And then on the top of this, you also have Japan and other, allied democracies. So when you look at kind of the totality of economic firepower we have in Russia and Ukraine and its allies, there is no question in my mind that there is no doubt that the Russian economy cannot win this war of attrition. Cannot win this war of attrition. So as long as Ukraine is going to receive economic and military aid, we can definitely outlast Russia. But I'm really hoping that the Western democracies are going to double down on economic and military support, so it's not a very long war of attrition. Ideally, we want to finish this war as soon as possible. It's in everybody's interest.
How do, and you're in government, how are you keeping up the people's morale? How do you, in the face of all of this damage and the unpredictability and all the rest, how do you keep the people energized?
Well, that's a good question, because the reality is that we all feel depressed sometimes in this situation. Sometimes I feel like I can't do it anymore, and then I think I cannot give up. Well, for a mere reason, because my loved one is at war, and I have to do everything possible, if not for the whole country, but at least to do everything possible to save the person that I love, and that gives me strength, and I think that works for everybody. It's just right now, Ukrainian army is people actively serving in the battle zone is about 700,000 people. So you can imagine, basically everybody in the country has knows somebody who is serving actively in the military. And then of course there are unfortunately many families who lost their loved ones. And I think this connection to the army is very helpful. And I think people are feeling very much, to what extent they depend on the army, but also to what extent the army depends on them. And I think this is what we came to realize, to what extent, the country cannot exist without a strong army. And that is something that we try to help with. And Ukrainians are doing wonders in that sense, because again, a probably less known story of this, Ukraine's resistance is to what extent this has been a decentralized effort. Because particularly the first month of war, government is always a bit slower to respond, particularly in, when there is, you need to act really fast. And I'm not saying the government was working badly, but there are some things that non-governmental organizations, civil society can do better. And in our case, we do have several big non-governmental organizations that have been fundraising for the army. And they've been doing miracles, and they did it like very, very fast. And what Ukrainians are doing is, when we were sitting in the bomb shelter on October 10th during attacks, and people were asking, people from abroad were asking, what did you do there? What were you thinking? And so on. I was like, I was donating to the non-governmental organizations that are helping to the army. And I think this became a national idea that we have to, to stay together, to help the army, and this is how we survive. And I think that we just have to keep on explaining that to people, and people understand it, again. Because this is so much like people are doing it themselves. It's not someone is forcing them to do it. One of the biggest organizations has collected about $4 billion in first 4 months of the war. And by end of May, half of the drones that Ukrainian army had were actually bought by civil society organizations. Which is, I think it's a bit different now because the government is buying more and getting more from our partners and so on and so forth. But when there was a need to react very quickly, that is where civil society stepped in, and that is how we actually survived, by many people doing small things. And that is what we try to to keep on repeating to ourselves. Every person matters, every small contribution matters. No matter what you do. You are a barista, you are selling coffee. Well, you are working in economy, you are paying taxes, and then taxes go to the army. That is what we are trying to do. But in terms of my work as a member of parliament specifically, because people keep on asking me, do you have sessions? And why? We do. And of course we do pass some legislation. But I think particularly the first couple of months of war, it was not that important what sort of legislation we were passing. It was the fact that we were there, we were gathering in the parliament's building, we didn't leave the country, we stayed in. That was actually crucially important.
You were showing your presence.
Yeah, we were showing our presence, and we were showing that we are there with the people. And we're doing it in different manner, and I think different members of parliament found different ways of, how to represent the people. I concentrated a lot on this international work. Another member of parliament who's my best friend in the parliament, Roman Kostanko, he's used to serve in the military before. He got back to the military. He's serving on the south right now. So he hardly ever appears in the parliament itself, but, he's doing a great job himself. There are many MPs who are working in, providing humanitarian aid and relief, coordinating those efforts and so on and so forth. Even without being government members, cabinet members in your case, right? But even despite the fact that I'm formally in opposition, which doesn't really matter that much in Ukraine right now, I think people have found different ways.
Opposition to the Russians.
To the Russia, yeah. That's the only thing that matters. So we are trying to do. When everybody is doing a little bit, that at the end makes a huge difference.
Yuri, can you help us understand perhaps, Irina, perhaps some differences between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army in terms of who's serving, how they're led, how they're equipped, and so forth?
I must say that I'm not a military expert, so probably my answers are going to be amateurish. But I would say, there is a giant difference between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. The Ukrainian army is really motivated. People volunteer to come to the army and defend the country. What we see is happening in Russia when you try to mobilize people instead of going to fight, they are fleeing the country. So the level of morale is very, very, very different. That's number one. Number two, there is a silver lining in this war in the sense that, Ukraine is not formally a member of NATO, but de facto it is now a member of NATO. Lots and lots of weapons were donated to Ukraine for this. And so this really helps the army to be technologically, a step or maybe multiple steps ahead of the Russian army. And we don't have quantities, we don't have as many guns as the Russians do, we don't have as many tanks as Russians do. But the quality of military equipment is technologically so much more advanced that we can compensate for the shortages with better quality.
Can I shortly add to that? Because, of course, Ukraine is much smaller than Russia, right? But, again, Ukrainian army right now is pretty big. It's, 700,000 people is a lot. And, of course, a lot of those people are people who either never served in the army or just did their obligatory training, which is, was probably not that, specialized and didn't make them into professional military. But the truth is that, indeed, lots of people volunteered. Actually, the single time I cried during the first 24 hours when this all started was when I saw the pictures on the internet of huge queues, like hundreds of people, queuing to recruit to the army. That is like, and it's still there. There are still people who are knocking on the door saying, like, I want to get mobilized, I want to go to the war. But we're saying, like, yeah, you just have to wait because we are now, like, in the quantity that we need in terms of people. So this morale is a huge factor. That is very much true. And also, of course, Ukrainian army has undergone quite lots of changes and reforms since 2014. I'll refer back to the example of my boyfriend. He's actually a doctor. He's a surgeon, a thoracic surgeon, but he did went to serve in the army in 2014, 2015. And that is when they started to do lots of changes in terms of how medical services are being provided on the battlefront. And they changed it quite a lot. According to the NATO standards, they have introduced the better medical help. And that is something that he has been involved in very actively. So now when he looks at how medical help is being provided inside Russian army, he's laughing about this because they're providing medical help like they did in the 70s. And literally like the medical kit that they have is from the 70s. Well, what our army has is very up-to-date and modern stuff that they got from the government or actually from the volunteers who are buying it to them. And the truth is, of course, it's still not perfect. It's still, we need more tanks, we need more of everything. But indeed, as Yuri pointed out, and this is an important thing, is we will never be a bigger army than Russia. But we can win by being a smarter and more innovative army. And that is why what we need is more, smart, innovative, technological equipment. Because if we are just given the old Soviet equipment, which was particularly at the beginning a huge trend, like we'll just give you the old Soviet tanks. That's what my partner said. He said, like, yeah, then we're going to be a small Soviet army fighting against a big Soviet army. We shall never win like this. We shall only win if we shall be a small but well-equipped modern army. And that is what we're trying to help build.
What do you need most from the United States?
Well, I wouldn't surprise anyone here if I say that we are very nervously watching the elections today.
So are we.
Yeah, I can imagine. Feeling pretty safe saying that here in Berkeley. Of course, we are worried because if there is a change in the Congress and different people take power, we don't know what the Republicans' position will be in terms of providing weapons. There are different signals, which we have to wait and see what will happen. What I'm most concerned of is even best case scenario, if Republicans still say we want to be providing weapons to Ukraine, but there will be more scrutiny. More scrutiny in our case means more delays. And more delays in our case means lives lost. We did have days when we were losing 100 people a day. 100 people a day were killed. So we hope that help will be provided, and the issues that we need more in terms of weapons now, something I know much more about than I used to, But the air defense system, that is crucial for civilian population and also for the military, of course. The multiple launcher system, MLRS, multiple launch rocket system, right? And tanks. And tanks is something that became a very strange discussion. Like, we are still not getting modern combat tanks. We have got the Soviet-style tanks from Poland, Slovakia, and everybody else, but nobody is willing to give us tanks. And that, well, you have provided us with HIMARSs, which can, shoot pretty far, like tanks are not shooting that far. I don't understand like this whole blockade about tanks. So maybe you can, I don't know, reach out to your representatives, as they say here in the States, right, and ask them about that, because, you know, we really need tanks as a way to protect our personnel. That's as simple as that, you know. People inside Soviet tanks are not protected in case it gets hit. People inside tanks that you have, or Germans have for that matter, are much better protected. So that is what we need. Tanks, yeah.
When the invasion started in February, the West imposed a number of economic sanctions on Russia. How effective have those sanctions been, and can they be made even more effective? Maybe Yuriy, you can take that.
Right, so I think, we should start with kind of doing backward induction. Is anybody going to attack Russia militarily? The answer is no. Does the change have to come from...
Unless they invade a NATO country.
Hopefully they will not do that. But, at this stage, nobody has any plans to invade Russia. If there is a change, it has to come from inside. To make a change, something in the sort of masses or elites or whoever has to change, right? It has to be an economic lever. Economic sanctions is one of these levers. People say it's not working, it's not doing this, it's not doing that. You look at the facts, and it's clear that sanctions are hurting the Russian economy. People say, the Russian economy is going to have a recession, roughly at 5%. Contraction, it seems like not a big number, but you should be thinking about counterfactuals, where the Russian economy should have been given these high oil prices and where it is now. And then the size of the contraction is going to be more like minus 15%. So it's very significant. You can also see that, the more targeted sanctions are, the more effective they are. For example, how many cars are produced in Russia today? It's only 10% of what they used to produce before the war. Okay, is this effective? Yes, it is effective. You look at the exports of energy, okay, this is where we have problems because, countries like India and China continue to buy Russian oil. This creates a loophole that is very hard to close. Now, some people will say, well, this is why, this will never work because you always have these leakages. But I would say to that there is no limit to perfection. You can always find ways to make sure that, Russia is isolated economically. It cannot import technology. It cannot export energy. For example, many people don't know, but a lot of Russian oil is transported by Western, oil tankers. Why they're doing this, why it's not closed yet. For some mysterious reason, the Russian diamonds are still going to Belgium. Why is that? I don't understand that. You can look at all sorts of pockets out there. You can still, those pain points that you can keep pushing. And so, the logic is, again, if you have a rational player, you understand that down the road, you're going to have an economic problem. And eventually, it's going to be a very bad situation for you. You should do backward induction. You should say, okay, I'm going to stop now. But, this is not happening in Russia. They don't still realize how bad it's going to be. And I guess, one benchmark you can keep in mind when you think about these issues, think about, the collapse of the Soviet Union. It invaded Afghanistan in 1978. The US government imposed lots and lots of sanctions. The Soviet Union could not import technology. They could only export a tiny bit of energy. Okay? Then in 86, energy prices collapse. The Soviet Union loses a lot of revenue. Okay? 86. In 81, we don't have the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was a much more closed economy. It didn't trade as much as Russia is doing today. So this kind of time clock is going to run a lot faster for the Russian economy. They're eating their reserves now. So, when we talk about the war of attrition, it's not just about helping Ukraine, it's also about making sure that Russia is going to run out of their resources as quickly as possible. So sanctions are working, we just need to ramp it up. If they don't understand it, do it again.
One
Go ahead,
very
yes.
small comment about sanctions, not against Russia actually, but against Iran. Because you were asking about those attacks on energy infrastructure, and majority of those attacks are done by the Iranian drones. And there was a recent investigation by Ukrainian investigative journalists who got hold of that drone, Iranian drone, which Iran has sent over to Russia. And the sad fact is the majority of the components of the drone were produced by the United States companies that Iran got a hold of. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed very specifically, because those small drones are doing huge damage to the Ukrainian society economics and not so much military, but, in terms of energy infrastructure. Yeah.
Very quickly, we'll talk a lot about sanctions in terms of oil, energy, and so on, but think about IT sanctions. We have a recent paper with a group of economists, some of whom are in this room, that you think about the Russian economy, it's running on American and European software. The clouds are, here in the US. Microsoft Word, maybe it's not an amazing, Office package, but, it's still, powering the Russian economy. Think about cell phones, you have Android software system. I'm not an expert there, but presumably you can disable lots and lots of, functionality for this system. So you can really slow down the Russian economy very, very quickly, if you want to.
And these are some questions from the audience, and this is a question that does involve energy. What implications does Ukraine's energy insecurity have on future renewable energy use and grid decentralization?
That's a great question, because I think that is one of the great hopes of this huge, terrible energy crisis, or crisis, if that's even the right word, is this, that actually more and more people understand to what extent decentralized grid would be better. Right, because right now what they're doing, the biggest problem right now is about 50% of Ukraine's electricity is nuclear power. And that provides the base load, which has been stable, working properly, and apart from the fact that they captured the biggest nuclear power plant. But they're not targeting nuclear power plants themselves, but they're targeting I'm not sure about the English word, and the transmission stations located near the nuclear power plant. So when that one is down, the nuclear power plant can still produce electricity, but it has no way to transit it, right? If that's, so in that sense, people are starting questioning, we are relying on this like one big nuclear power plant. Is that smart if it is so vulnerable to a single attack? Not the plant itself, but basically the plant, right? So people are thinking more and more about, actually over the summer there was an increase in people who have individual houses who were installing solar panels, because they were thinking like, okay, just in case I'm going to do this. I also work quite a lot with the Renewables Association in Ukraine. They're seeing great prospects in Ukraine in terms of renewables because of that, because people are understanding that renewables, apart from being good for the environment and all of that, not a very big part of the Ukraine's thinking right now, but it's about energy security, because renewable energy is produced locally, right? And people are getting more and more used to the idea that this is the path forward. And I do think that it will be. I'm seeing lots of interest on the business side, even now. They're saying, yeah, probably not today, but if things calm down, we're planning to invest because that is where the future lies. And Ukraine is a huge territory, and we can do, particularly on the south, we can do lots of solar energy. We're actually switching in some cities from gas to biomass for heating, again, because it's locally produced, and we still produce gas as well, but it's better to use local, resources. So it's actually given me hope that this can be an opening to transit for greener energy.
Maybe something positive that comes out of this situation. This is an interesting. What percent of the Ukrainian population do you think supports the continuation of the war?
The way it's formulated is a bit difficult to answer because, of course, I want the war to stop. Like today, I don't want the war to continue. Trust me, I'm that this is not a pleasant situation to be in. The question is on what conditions. And right now, if you ask people as like, would you agree for the war to stop in case we have to give up part of our territory? Over 90% of people would say no. And it can sound like, oh, you want too much. Well, no, it's just the right thing to want. It's our territory, you know, like which state would you give up in case you, okay, don't start coming up with the funny ideas. But, no, but the thing is like, right, it's A, it's our territory. B, and that is the biggest argument, is people who are under occupied territories are living in terrible conditions. They're being, you know, thrown into jails, they're being tortured, raped. Like, we cannot just agree for that to continue happening just because we want to have electricity all day. I mean, I want to have electricity all day, but also if it comes at a cost of someone being thrown into jail without any court and trial, then it's not the price that I'm willing to accept. And issue number 3, and people keep on asking me that, like, well, what about Crimea? You see, the thing is that Crimea has been annexed almost 9 years, 8.5 years ago, 2014. And since then, Crimea has been used as a basically military base by Russia. They have militarized the Crimea so much. And basically, they have captured the south of Ukraine because they were holding Crimea since 2014. So even if we skip all the you know international law arguments and all of that, it's just not smart to allow them to stay in Crimea, because that way we will always be in danger of yet another invasion. So that is one of the things that we have to remember. Like, even if we skip the nice and argument, it's just from the realistic perspective, we need it back because we don't want to be invaded again from Crimea.
We're getting questions also from the live stream, and these two are somewhat related. Do you think a third party could help negotiate peace? And if so, what might that third party be? And then what happens to Russia after the war?
Can I take the first one and you take the second? So, if you ask Erdogan, he will say that he can negotiate his way out of this. He's been trying to act as a third-party side who is kind of neutral and trying to make peace. But the reality is this: whoever comes up with the idea, I can negotiate peace, show me a single person in the world who can say, we will make a deal, and I, the third party, will make sure that Putin follows up on what we agreed upon. Like, a single person in the world who will say that I will make sure Putin does what he promised to do. Even in Russia, for that matter. I don't think there is a single person who can guarantee that Putin will do whatever we will agree upon on doing, right? And because of that, I don't see a way, by negotiating, because nobody can make sure that whatever we agree upon would actually be, followed up and fulfilled by Putin.
I want to second what Nina said. Think about this invasion. It violated the Treaty of Friendship between Russia and Ukraine. It violated the Budapest Memorandum. It violated the Helsinki Final Act. It violated the UN Charter and many, many, many other agreements. What makes you think that now he will respect whatever deal he is going to make? I don't think there is any chance this is going to be enforced by anybody and will be treated as a serious negotiation by the Russians. About the future of Russia, I think we should...
Well, does that mean, between the two of you, are you saying that so long as Putin is the head of Russia, there's no possibility for a negotiated peace?
Most likely. I mean, there is definitely, and I'm saying it very openly, until Putin is alive, we are always in danger. I mean, the process can slow down, we can go into, slower phase of war or anything. But he has no way of stopping, right? If he stops now, that undermines his power inside Russia. And if he doesn't stop, that also undermines his power. So he's in a deadlock situation, but he will keep on doing that because he just cannot stop, right? There is no reason for him to stop. So, yeah, as long as he is alive, even if there is some quieter periods on the battlefront, we will always be living under, under danger of waking up at 4 a.m. from missiles attacks. So unfortunately, yes, we have to wait for a change of regime in Russia, which is we don't know how that will take place and who will come instead of him. But for real, I don't think anybody can trust whatever Putin will promise to do at this point.
Yuri?
Yeah, the future of Russia, I'm not a historian, but I can just, make a few casual observations to put this in the right perspective. I think, World War I ended with a few empires being disintegrated. World War II, again, a few empires disintegrated. The British Empire, the French Empire. The end of the Cold War, another empire disintegrated. Every time, you have a big loss. It may be Russo-Japanese War, or it may be, some other war, Ukrainian War, many years ago in the 19th century. Empires disintegrate. I don't like quoting Lenin, but, he said that Russia is the prison of peoples and, just another empire. And I think, there is a good chance that, Russia is not going to survive this war as one state. It will be a collection of different states. But, there is a lot of uncertainty about how Russia is going to look after this.
How can the average person help Ukraine? Is there a way to contribute to the Ukrainian army?
Oh, yes. Google.
We know it.
Yeah, Google. You go online and Google Come Back Alive. That is the biggest volunteer foundation in Ukraine that is helping the army. They're great. They're super great. You can follow them on Twitter, and they're the one who actually provided drones to the army and so on and so forth. Of course, they're not buying tanks, because for a single reason, nobody's selling them to them. They're willing to. But they're great, for real. I know some members of the team, I know the leadership, they're super great. They're the biggest foundation. All Ukrainians trust them. Or there are several others that you can find as well, that you can donate. Or if you want to help civilians, well, still donate to Come Back Alive, because, donating to the army is the best way to protect civilians. That is the fact. But you can also go and find some humanitarian organizations that are doing humanitarian aid and relief. And the biggest aid and relief in that sense that I would advertise is helping establish bomb shelters at schools. I mean, that doesn't sound like something you would think of automatically, but the reality is this. If parents cannot send their kids to school because there is no bomb shelter, they cannot work, their kids are losing in terms of quality of education, and it all starts just this vicious circle. So this minor issue of just find a local community and say hey, we have $5,000, help us refurbish and do some minor repairments in the bomb shelter so that kids would be safe to go there. That's going to be a huge deal for people. I know myself, my son goes to school which has a good bomb shelter, but I feel for parents whose schools have terrible bomb shelters or don't have bomb shelters at all. That's something that you can help with.
Obviously we want to think about this as donations because Ukraine is in a very difficult situation, but I want to give you a slightly different perspective. Think about this as investment in global security. Ukraine wants $40 billion from its allies to keep the economy running in 2023. It is a lot of money, $40 billion. It's a lot of money. But think about this in a different way. How much this money is a fraction of GDP of the US, EU, and other countries? It's a tiny fraction of GDP, 0.01% or maybe less than that. How much is that as a fraction of the NATO budget? It's probably 4%, maybe 3%. It's a tiny fraction. Think about this as how much all these European governments and the US as well spend on supporting households to deal with high energy prices. Again, it's a small fraction, maybe 5%, 9%. So instead of, treating the symptoms like, energy prices are high because of Russia, think about this as a way to have a solution to this that is going to be lasting. It's not going to be just, giving out money to people to deal with their energy bills. So we have to be thinking about more strategically. Also think about this as how much it would cost if Ukraine loses and we have a serious arms race between, Russia and the US or US and China. At the height of the Cold War, U.S. was spending more than 10% of GDP on military stuff. In current money, it's more than $2 trillion. And think about this, $2 trillion versus $30 billion. And Ukraine is given an astronomical return on this investment, right? So we're taking care of Russian tanks, all this aggression, all this, authoritarian regimes. It's a huge investment. So it's not just, a donation. Think about this as an investment.
This is a somewhat related question, but apart from economic sanctions, what are your expectations from other countries to support Ukraine?
Well, did I mention tanks?
Thanks.
Because that would be great. Support in terms of weapons is crucially important. That is what is indeed making a difference for all of us.
And the speed with which.
And the speed, yeah. And then, of course, training of our military personnel is also very important, and that has taken place, right? I'm not complaining about that, but I just reiterating to what extent that is very much important. Maybe I will, from a different perspective, and get back to the sanctions issue, because of course, as Yuriy has been talking a lot about economic sanction and how they affect the Russian economy, but then there are also personal sanctions against individuals. And I know some of them have been introduced, but that has taken quite some time. Son of Medvedev, who is the former president of Russia, who's gone crazy. Probably you don't read him too much, but because probably most of you don't read Russian, but if you read him, guy has gone completely nuts. He's speaking about getting rid of Satan in Ukraine and fighting gay parades in Donetsk, and he's completely nuts. And his son was living in New York, in the US, and he had a visa. Why? And I mean, one may say that, human rights arguments, that the children are responsible for the sins of their parents. Well, but my son has to go to the bomb shelter almost every day and skip math or whatever else, in his school. My son is bearing this load. So the kids of the Russian elites should not get visas to the United States. And if they do, those should be cancelled and they should go back to Mother Russia and really have a serious talk to their parents. Why the hell? And the reality is that they are still studying in the American universities. I mean, probably not here at UC Berkeley, I don't know of that, but just go through the list. This is unacceptable, and this is something that you can still do. And this will have actually a huge effect. Because, the Russian elites are so wealthy, it probably will not make a huge difference for them if they lose even half of their wealth in terms of their daily life, right? But if their kids cannot travel, to Italy for shopping or, to go study in American universities, that will actually make a difference for their individual lives. So that is not many people are paying attention to that, but that will actually make a difference in terms of putting pressure on the Russian elites.
What about the likelihood of war crime prosecutions? How do you look at that?
Oh, that is a lot is being done on that, and actually the Commission on Sexual Crimes that I'm deputy head of is also part of this effort. So what we are doing is we are not so much we as members of parliament, but we are helping also in that sense. But the prosecutor's office, police is doing a lot to document the crimes. We are getting actually policemen from other EU states who come to help document all the crimes. Trying to collect all the evidence possible. It's a huge number. It's you must have seen most recently Izum, which was a month ago, 400 graves, some of them children, some of them, tortured and all of that. Not a single country would be able to document this amount of crimes themselves. So that is something that we are doing with the hope to start to have a big international tribunal, which I'm sure will take place at some point. And it's our responsibility. This is what we need to do for the victims. We have to do it, even if it's going to take 10 years.
A long time.
Yeah.
We have time for one last comment from each of you, and let me just ask each of you if you have one central point about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and where things stand and what you see the future as that you'd like this audience to take from today's panel, what would it be? Yuriy, we'll start with you.
It's a very difficult question in one sentence. I would say this, many people think of war as being, a war in a distant country about people who we know very little about, in the words of Chamberlain, when he basically gave the Czechoslovakia to Hitler. You should not think that. That war is a lot closer to all of us than many of us think. This is not just about Ukraine. This war can touch us here in California, it can touch us in Europe, anywhere. So we have to be thinking of this as not a Ukrainian problem, it's really a global problem.
You have stolen what I was about to say. But indeed, I do think that, it took me 2 days to travel here. California is very far away from Ukraine. So the question is, why should we care? And I think that there are two reasons why people should care. First, because this war just violates the very basic principles of human existence, right? Nobody should be afraid of getting raped by a soldier who just invaded your country. That just goes against any, basic principles of human lives. That is just wrong on many levels. And what we are fighting for is the righteous cause, just like Americans were in your war against the Brits. And you very much relied also on support of France at that time, right? And I think that is important to remember, that also the United States has been in a period of its history relying on support from abroad. I'm not saying you have to pay back. I'm just saying that there are situations of when the very basic principles of life are at stake, and then everybody should get involved. And the second argument is this: this war is not just violating the very basic principles of human life and coexistence. It also violates the very principles of international order, right? If we allow Russia to do what it is doing to Ukraine right now, what is there to stop Russia from saying, like, hey, what was our deal with Alaska? We don't like it anymore. We probably should get it back. We can also invade whatever else country, or any other country can say the same. If we don't respect the sanctity of Ukraine's borders, what is there to respect the sanctity of any borders at that matter, right? So I think that this is also important. We are also fighting for preservation of the world order, of very basic principles of the world order, at least. And that is why, we very much hope that the world will continue supporting us, because we are fighting for the whole globe now, not just for ourselves.
Well, I think you have the support of all of us here. Thank you so much for your comments and for coming.